Hey, everybody. Welcome to Where to Start with AWS as a Developer. If you're curious about Amazon Web Services, AWS, or just cloud infrastructure in general, and you don't know where to start, this talk is for you. So, AWS was a thing that I was wanting to get into for some time. Maybe like me, you were just curious to learn more about it. Maybe you're interested in following some sort of certification path. Uh, maybe you have something at work that uses AWS and you want to learn it to be able to get better at your job. So I've been in that situation. I felt all of those things. Um, but it can be really overwhelming to learn about. And so it's hard to know where to get started. But learning AWS and cloud infrastructure in general is a huge opportunity for your career. This chart was from 2019, and cloud engineering is a $100 billion market as of a couple of years ago. And you can see that AWS is actually leading that, and followed by Microsoft Azure and Google Cloud, also known as GCP. So AWS is really dominating this huge market, and it's a really good thing to learn as a developer to broaden your skill set. I was fortunate enough to have some opportunities come up at work. I work for Auth0, an identity and access management company. We rely on AWS heavily for a lot of things. And I needed to deploy an application for the DevRel team. And in doing so, I had to log into AWS and try to start figuring things out. Of course, when I first logged in, I was met with this massive list of services. As of right now, I think there's something like over 175 services on AWS. It's huge. And so trying to figure out where to start and how to learn all of this stuff can be super overwhelming. You start to really feel like an imposter, just going, just completely lost, logging in, your eyes glaze over, your head spins. So I wanted to build a talk that would share the things that I did to start learning AWS and help others who might be having the same challenges. So in this talk today, we're going to cover a few big topics. We're going to talk about big AWS concepts for developers. We're going to talk about key AWS services for developers, the ones that you're going to come across most frequently. And we're also going to talk about pitfalls to look out for as you're learning AWS. And then lastly, we'll talk about the certification path, all the different pieces of that puzzle for getting those certifications. So I'm Sam Julien. You can find me at samjulien.com. I lead developer relations at Auth0. We're an access and identity management company. Basically, we help you build your logins for your applications, manage your users, manage rules and permissions. I'm also an author. I've written a book called Getting Started in Developer Relations, all about jumping into DevRel. And then I've also written a book called Guide to Tiny Experiments, which is a framework for finishing all those projects that you've got on your backlog. I also write a weekly newsletter called Developer Micro Skills, where I send out actionable, practical ways to improve your career as a developer or developer advocate. And lastly, I'm an instructor at egghead.io. I actually have a new course on Egghead about deploying Ghost to AWS using RDS and EC2. We'll actually talk about in a few minutes what RDS and EC2 actually are, but it's a great hands-on project for digging into this stuff and learning it a little bit more thoroughly. If you're watching this talk, you're likely really interested in building your career. At Auth0, we have two programs that I want you to check out. We have the Ambassador program, which is like a DevRel training program. And then we also have the Apollo program, which is our guest author program. So definitely go check those out. We've got a lot of cool things going on with those two programs, and we'd love to have you be part of it. So again, I said that the top takeaways for this talk are going to be the big AWS concepts for developers, some of the key services that you're going to want to focus on in the beginning, pitfalls that you're going to need to look out for as you learn, and then some information on the certification path. So let's jump right into concepts that you're going to want to focus on as you learn AWS. There's sort of just some big things that if you can wrap your head around them, they will help you not only understand AWS, but also Azure and GCP and just the whole cloud infrastructure concept in general. And that kind of brings us to one important question. What is the cloud anyway? What are we talking about here? Why do people care so much about AWS? And why is this $100 billion industry? The answer comes from the ability to grow infrastructure. So when you build a website and you want to launch a website or a business that revolves around a website, what you used to have to do is you had to go out and buy physical servers and physical networking devices and build all that infrastructure yourself to be able to host your site. And that is, of course, very expensive. It's also very hard to adapt in situations like getting a lot of traffic or needing to upgrade and things like that. So the cloud infrastructure is basically a way for you to borrow a bunch of infrastructure that big companies have and run your applications on it and be able to grow it quickly without having to then shell out a bunch of money for servers. So, for example, one concept that you're going to hear a lot in AWS certification tests and things like that is the idea of capital expenses versus operating expenses. So, capital expense is a big upfront cost. So, if you had to buy a bunch of servers to run your website, you might have to spend like $1 million on servers and networking infrastructure and all of that. Instead, you can use AWS or Azure or GCP's networking infrastructure. Their servers sitting in a warehouse somewhere and their networking hardware and all of those things, you can just use them and not have to buy all that yourself. And that becomes then an operating expense, an ongoing monthly expense that you can just pay for your infrastructure instead of having to have these big upfront expenses. So that's one big benefit of cloud infrastructure. The other that I kind of alluded to is this idea of scalability. So there's two types of scalability here. There is the growing up and growing out. So let's say, for example, you've got a server and you need to do some more complicated calculations. Maybe you got into machine learning or something and you need to build models and that kind of thing. So you need a bigger server for that. You need a bigger and better server for that. So if you had to do this yourself, you'd have to go out and either buy a new server or you'd have to go in there, crack open your server, upgrade the RAM, put in a new hard drive, all of that kind of stuff. You can do this on AWS very easily. You can just upgrade your server very quickly at the touch of a button, essentially with an API call, and not have to worry about it. You just pay a little bit more per month or a lot more per month, depending on how much you do. So that's vertical scaling. There's also something called horizontal scaling. Horizontal scaling is being able to handle more traffic. So in some cases, what you want is you want to be able to have multiple servers so that if you get a lot of traffic from a lot of different parts of the world, you can divide that traffic up amongst a lot of different servers. Now, a really fun example of this it would be the if you've ever seen the show *Halt and Catch Fire*. It's a show about IT and tech companies in the '80s and '90s, and they go through these problems of needing to have bigger servers and more servers, and where are we going to store our servers? All of this would have been solved with AWS. Right alongside of scalability is this concept of elasticity. And elasticity is the idea of being able to scale vertically or horizontally and scale back down. So let's say you had the example of horizontal scaling. You have one server. And let's say that you have this business and you're making these artisanal dog toys and you're selling these dog toys on your website, you're hosting it yourself. And then one day, the Thoughts of Dog Twitter account with 3.6 million followers tweets about your artisanal dog toys. All of a sudden, your website is completely inundated with traffic, and so if you had to deal with this yourself, having your own servers, you might actually crash your website because you only have one server and it just goes down from all that. With AWS, you can scale up and quickly spin up multiple servers to handle that increase in traffic without having to prepay for that and then scale it back down once that demand has calmed down. So this concept is called elasticity. So that combination of things, the capital expenses versus operating expenses, the scalability and the elasticity, these are some of the core reasons that AWS and cloud infrastructure is so massive because it allows these things instead of these companies having to buy enough server capacity to account for big spikes in traffic on holidays, but then they sit empty 364 days of the year. You can just spin up all that stuff really quickly, scale it back down, and just respond quickly to events. And it overall is going to end up being cheaper in the long run. So these are just some core concepts that it's helpful to have in mind as you start to learn this stuff. One of the hardest parts of doing some of these exams is just remembering all of the key AWS services. So I want to walk you through. There's like I said, hundreds of services. So there's so many that I'm not going to be able to list here, but I just want to give you a few that you're going to run into as soon as you start trying to learn things as a developer on AWS. The first one you'll likely run into is EC2. EC2 is where you run servers. EC2 stands for Elastic Compute Cloud. And you can just think of this as a server. You're going to hear this name EC2 Instance. An instance is just an instance of a server. So this is where you would host like a traditional web application. Let's say you had a website running Nest.js as a backend and some sort of front end. You would just put that on a server and it would run your server. So when you think of EC2, think of traditional servers. Another service that's going to come up a lot for you as a developer is AWS Lambda. So Lambda comes from functional programming. And so you can think of, when you think of Lambda, think of function, because what a Lambda is it's a serverless function. Basically what this means is that you can run a piece of code. It could be in JavaScript or Python or a lot of other options, but you can run a piece of code that is going to give you an output when given an input that you don't have to actually spin up and configure an entire server for. It's sort of just a ready-made environment that you can put in some code and get some results out of it. And this works really well for just API calls or calculations, things like that, where you don't need a full-fledged server to actually do a bunch of things for you and maintain state. You just need a function that you can call from your front end to get some information. So Lambda is super, super useful. The next one you'll come across is S3. S3 stands for Simple Storage Service. And you see that little bucket there. That is the name of the entity. So you're going to have an S3 bucket. And S3 is used for storing files, images, static files, basically anything that you need to store on the internet, you would store in an S3 bucket. So that could mean the images for your site. It could also actually mean your entire front end could be hosted in an S3 bucket. This is very common to do because at the end of the day, a front end is just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So that's one thing you might run into, pretty common. The next one is Route 53. Route 53 is DNS. So whenever you see Route 53, think DNS. This is for configuring like all of your domain names. You can connect Route 53 to EC2 instances and other places. Route comes from Route 66, which is a big highway in the US. So, you know, and think about traffic, that kind of thing. 53 is the port where DNS server requests are addressed. So that's sort of a play on Route 66, Route 53, and that's how you can remember that DNS. Another service you're going to likely run into is called RDS. RDS stands for Relational Database Service. And RDS is where you would do things like have MySQL, PostgreSQL, Microsoft SQL Server, any of those SQL or relational databases will run through Relational Database Service, RDS. And what's nice about this is that usually when you have to host your own database, you have to do a bunch of maintenance and work on it. And a lot of that gets taken care of by the fact that it's hosted by AWS. Not all of the maintenance does, but some of the bigger overhead that you normally have when you have to host your own database gets taken care of there. You'll also hear of Amazon has an SQL service called Aurora. I didn't put that in here, but that's another one that will come up when you're looking at databases. Another Amazon service that's related to database is called DynamoDB. DynamoDB is AWS's NoSQL solution. So it's sort of like a competitor to MongoDB. I don't use DynamoDB myself very much. I just haven't had an opportunity to, but it is really, really popular. It's one that you'll probably come across as you start to get into this stuff. And then the last service that I wanted to mention is AWS Amplify. Amplify is a platform for building full stack apps really quickly. It's a framework that consists of things like UI libraries, components, a CLI tool chain, and a console. I I mentioned Amplify partially because their DevRel team is very active in the community. So you're likely going to run into Amplify as you're learning AWS. And so it's a good idea to kind of keep that in the back of your mind, and you can launch applications with it and that kind of thing. So again, there's a million different, well, not a million, but close to a million different services out there. I didn't even mention a lot of the ones related to like code and continuous delivery and things like, there's a whole other host, but this is just focused on some of the development stuff that you'll likely run into right away as you're trying to host applications on AWS. So as you're learning AWS, there's going to be some things that come up that will likely cause some problems for you. Um, the problem with AWS, uh, along with the sheer complexity of AWS, it's also not free. There's really a lot of issues that you need to work through as you're learning it, because you can get a little dangerous really quickly and wreak a lot of havoc if you're not aware of what you're doing. So there's two big areas that I want you to keep in mind as you're learning AWS. The first one is billing. Like I said, AWS is not free to use. There is a free tier that I'm going to talk about in a second, and there are some services that are free. Usually the costs are minor and for short periods of time, but the biggest thing that happens is, you'll go through some tutorial, you'll set up a bunch of resources, and then you'll get interrupted, or you'll have to go do something else, and you'll completely forget about that. And then all of a sudden you've got this big bill at the end of the month for all these servers and resources and things that you've spun up, and that can be really annoying. You might be able to contact AWS to get some help with that, but even that is just a big hassle. So I want to give you a few tips to look out for. First of all, always clean up after yourself when you're doing any sort of tutorials on AWS. Make sure that, even don't ever fall into the trap of thinking like, well, I might come back to this later and like tinker around with this. No, it's going to be a lot faster for you to just get extra practice by spinning it up again. Unless you have a very specific reason to leave a tutorial resource running, always clean up after you're done. You'll spare yourself a lot of headaches. Another big tip would be, if possible, try to find a platform that uses labs instead of a live AWS account. My favorite resource out there for learning AWS is A Cloud Guru. It's a learning platform, course platform, and they actually do have a lab platform that spins up provisioned AWS demo accounts that you can go in, you can tinker with, spin up a bunch of services, and then when you close it out, it just shuts everything down, destroys the whole instance, and and then you don't have to worry about billing or anything. I assume that there are other platforms that have these labs, so keep checking them out, but A Cloud Guru for sure does. Can't recommend that enough. Another thing you really want to get familiar with is the free tier. So the free tier comes in a few different flavors. There's a few different things. There's some services are completely free all the time. These are usually the ones that just orchestrate services or spin up services. There's one like, for example, CloudFormation uses these templates that spin up resources. So the actual service of CloudFormation is free, but all the resources that it creates, like servers and all that, are not free. So there's stuff like that. When you first sign up for an AWS account, there is a 12-month free tier that gives you a certain amount of things for free for 12 months. For example, it'll give you a certain number of hours on EC2 every month for 12 months. I can't remember what it is. I think it's like 700 hours a month or something like that. But definitely, if you're starting to learn AWS, even if you already have an existing account that you created a long time ago, go ahead and just create a new account, take advantage of the free plan while you're trying to get a certification or something else. And then lastly, there are these trials. I think a lot of those services that have trials, you're likely not going to run into as just a regular web developer, but there are some that give you access for 30 days or 60 days or things like that. So take advantage of that. Lastly, on the billing side, your best friend is going to be billing alarms. You can set up these billing alarms that will let you know if you're approaching any sort of threshold for cost. This uses a service called CloudWatch, where you can actually go in, you can create an alarm to say like, hey, let me know if my bill crosses $5 a month, or is forecasted to approach X number of dollars a month. And what will happen is you'll get this email from AWS. This is an example from my account where it says like, hey, you wanted us to let you know about $5. You're actually forecasted now to hit $13.89. And what that does for me is it says like, oh, I must have forgotten to destroy a server or a database or something like that when I was going through and doing some learning. So big thing for you to do there. In the resources that I linked to, there's a video on Egghead that actually walks you exactly through how to do this. So check that out. I'll have the link at the end. The other big area that you need to pay attention to as a pitfall is access and identity and access management. No surprise there that I'm talking about that being the Auth0 guy, but this is a big one. So a few things to know here. There's a lot of complexity with the way that users, groups, permissions, policies, a lot of stuff going on there. So it's very important that you are careful with this because it's very easy to accidentally give somebody access to something that could run up a big bill for you or expose a bunch of company data, things like that. So one thing that you'll want to become familiar with is the idea of the principle of least privilege. This basically means that you want to only grant access to the very least amount of resources and information that a user or an application needs. So keep that in mind. You don't want to give a user access to everything. You just want to give them exactly what they need, even down to the granularity of like reading but not writing. One of the best things you can do is set up multi-factor authentication in all of your AWS accounts, especially if it's a root account that has access to billing and things like that. Luckily, when you log into AWS and go to IAM, you're going to see this security alert and a list of best practices that you can go through. And there's this nice little link here that just says enable MFA, and you can go through and set that up. So highly, highly recommend doing that. Lastly, I definitely recommend using some sort of sandbox account. Never use your root account for tutorials and things like that. If possible, just create your own little demo account isolated from your company. You can usually have your IT department set that up, or you can set up a personal account, but always use something that is not connected to company data or production applications or anything like that. If you're just trying to learn, you can wreak havoc very quickly in these scenarios. And again, I mentioned labs before. That's another good use case for this. Okay, so let's also talk about AWS certifications. So there's a number of these certifications in IT, and in tech. Not all certifications are created equal, but with AWS, these certifications are extremely valuable. They're designed to minimize false positives, and they're fairly rigorous. So employers really know that these are a solid benchmark of knowledge. So this could be a great way to add some zeros to your paycheck or be more appealing to a consultancy or something like that. They're great for the long term. If you start to do this and you're interested in AWS and cloud engineering. So the first exam is the cloud practitioner exam. This is the one that I just passed. It's a foundational exam recommended for people with about 6 months of experience. It's high level. It's not super technical. It gets your feet wet with AWS. I will say it wasn't a walk in the park. I kind of expected it to be pretty easy, but I studied a lot for it, and it's definitely doable. Um, but it definitely does require some time investment and some studying. After you get the cloud practitioner, there is the associate level exams. These are recommended for people with about a year of experience and are a little bit deeper, still pretty broad in their scope. So there's three. There's the solutions architect associate, there's the sysops admin associate, and there's the developer associate. So solutions architect is sort of broad scope, general like app architecture, things like that. Sysops is related to, system administration, DevOps, infrastructure, that kind of thing. And then developer associated, more focused on code and deployment of, applications, that kind of thing. Now you're probably thinking, oh, well, obviously I want to do the developer associate one, but I do want to let you know a little caveat here. The next level up is the professional exams. And there's not a developer professional exam. The two professional exams are much, much deeper. And there's only two of them. There's solutions architect professional and then DevOps engineer professional. So what a lot of people do is they go get the solutions architect associate and then the solutions architect professional. And then if they want to round out and go back to the developer associate, they'll do that as well. The solutions architect professional is one of the most valuable certifications out there right now. It's very, very deep. and really shows people you know your stuff when it comes to cloud engineering. So highly recommend that. Beyond that, there are these specialty exams, and the specialty exams go very, very deep in a very small, narrow area. So you can see things like machine learning and data analytics and that kind of thing. So these are just sort of if you want an additional layer of certification. For developers, most of these aren't going to really make sense unless you get into something like machine learning or you really want to go deep on the database side. Um, so yeah, so that's everything. Let's do a recap here because I know I've hit you with a ton of information. So we talked about in the beginning how cloud infrastructure is $100 billion market, and that's probably low since this was a couple of years ago, and how AWS is at the top of that food chain right now, followed only by Azure and GCP. So it's important if you're looking to grow your career. This is one great, great avenue to do that. Unfortunately, AWS is absolutely complex, very difficult to get into. And so you've got to really develop a strategy to get into it. So let's review these things that we talked about. We talked about the concepts, we talked about the key services, we talked about pitfalls to look out for, and we talked about the certification path. So on the concept side, we talked about how the cloud is a way to virtualize all this network infrastructure and make it easy to grow just by clicking buttons. And this changes the server and network infrastructure from a big upfront capital expense to an ongoing operating expense. In addition, you've got these concepts of scalability, where if you need to get a bigger machine for your server, instead of having to go out and buy that yourself, you can just do it with a click of a button with AWS and even do it automatically. Same thing goes for the horizontal scaling. If you need to grow outward and get more servers to handle more traffic, you can do that very easily. And this relates to elasticity, which, as you can see from the little accordion icon there, lets you grow outward or upward and shrink back down according to demand. We also covered a handful of AWS services. The ones I really want you to be sure to remember are EC2, which is the traditional server, and then also Lambda, which are the serverless functions, and then S3, which is where you're going to host all of your static files and images and that kind of thing. We talked about pitfalls specifically. Billing being the big one. Always make sure to clean up after yourself. Try to use labs wherever you can. Use the free tier to your advantage as best you can. And then lastly, set up billing alarms. That's going to save you a lot of heartache and money in the future. And then the other big pitfall is access and identity and access management, IAM. Make sure you're using the principle of least privilege. Don't grant access to applications or users that don't need it. Make sure you set up multi-factor authentication in all of your accounts. And wherever possible, use a sandbox account that's isolated from your production code and from your customer data. And lastly, we covered the certification path, the foundational one being the cloud practitioner exam. Then from there, you can go through the associate exams of solutions architect, sysops admin, or developer associate. And then the big ones are the professional exams, the solutions architect professional, and the DevOps engineer professional. And then if you really want to specialize, there are these 6 other specialty exams, and I think they add to these over time, but these are the big 6 specialty exams. And so that is everything. Hopefully that helps. It took me a lot of time to figure out this path through AWS, coming from a pure front end and back end full stack developer perspective. I had never done much DevOps or infrastructure, things like that. So hopefully this saves you some time and some heartache and maybe a little money as well. I have a whole boatload of resources and links and these slides and everything at samj.im/start-aws-talk. And if you ever want to chat, you can hit me up on Twitter at Sam Julien. I'm also on the AWS Newbies Discord from time to time. So please feel free to keep in touch. And thank you so much.